Thank you all for joining us for the second installment of the ALPINE Fall Webinar Series. Today, we're talking about faculty collaboration in land conservation initiatives. We're going to ask that you please submit questions for our presenters using the Q&A function, which should be located at the top or bottom of your screen. You can also use the chat to communicate with the presenters or let us know if you're having any technical difficulties. I will now hand it over to Jim Levitt, the Director of the International Land Conservation Network at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, to introduce the webinar. Jim, go ahead.
Thank you, Robin. Good afternoon, everyone. It is after a torrential rain in Belmont, Massachusetts yesterday, a beautiful blue sky day, and we have all the fall colors coming in. I just got back from Maine, and I can tell you, it is at peak up there. Today we have two scholars, two academics, who are going to present to us their thoughts on faculty collaboration in land conservation initiatives. That is, how does the research that's done in the academy help to advance the practice of land conservation in the field? Our first guest is going to be June Hammond Rowan, who is a research associate professor at Plymouth State University in New Hampshire. She's going to give us a presentation on local land use planning and how that incorporates land conservation techniques and projects. I think it's very important, both for the audience that's going to be here today to see how we're integrating research into practice, but also very important for us to reach out to the planning professionals and boards that are so present throughout New England. Our second presenter is Dr. Elizabeth Hammond Infield, who will discuss a project that she's working on right now that I've had the pleasure to sit in on several times. It's a project for the Northern Appalachian Landscape Partnership, which is a group of regional conservation partnerships operating along the Appalachian Trail from Mount Katahdin to the New York State locus of the Appalachian Trail. Elizabeth's really pioneering ways for the nonprofit and public managers of the Appalachian Trail to incorporate the voices and the views of underrepresented groups, among other things. And I think she's going to talk about that, and we're going to have Dennis Schaefer from the Appalachian Trail Conservancy comment on the usefulness of that approach, not only in New England, but across the entire trail from Maine to Georgia and beyond. So with that, I'm going to welcome you both and pass the microphone to June Hammond Rowan, who is in her home, I believe, in Plymouth, New Hampshire.
Thank you, Jim. I'm here in my office today at Plymouth State University after teaching this morning, as we are trying to do some face-to-face instruction, which has been interesting at best. But anyway, so I've been working for about a year now on this project about trying to assess how local land use planning gets incorporated or incorporates land conservation principles. I do my work mostly here in New Hampshire for a variety of reasons, but so we've been trying to assess different aspects of land conservation and land use planning. Do you want to go to the next slide? The back. So the background for this, in my interest, I have worked previously as a planner before coming into academics. So I have, over the years, kind of developed this thought about how does development really change the landscape? We all know that it does, but as I've gotten more and more interested specifically in land conservation and thinking about conservation science, I see a fair amount in the literature kind of comments that talk about you know, that land use planning can be a way to help remedy and reduce the impacts that we have of development on our resources. We've done a good job, I think, of sort of identifying sprawling land use, converts natural habitats into urban, suburban kind of landforms, land cover, land use. But then, you know, oftentimes the conservation sort of community will say, hey, you know, better land use planning is a good way to do this, without really understanding what that planning process is and how can it be better interfaced to engage in better land conservation. So the next slide, please. So given that I have a fairly strong background in planning, I've tried to sort of think this through a bit. And for those of you that, you know, may be familiar with sort of that land use planning process, it really, you know, the concept is that the way our enabling statutes are set up is that land use planning is a local decision-making process for the most part. I use the term planning boards throughout this presentation. A lot of other states, they're called planning commissions, but in general, planning boards, planning commissions are really the local groups in our communities where they are doing different planning steps that lead from to creating plans for the communities and then implementing them through land use regulations. So the thought has been that, you know, if we look at ways of incorporating ecological principles in that land use decision-making process, it could end up helping to conserve habitats. That's the general idea. And the good part about this is that it really does sort of respect the autonomy of our local decision-making process. I often try to say, like, our landscape changes a lot based on what the planning board's deciding every Thursday, that third Thursday of the month when they meet at their planning board meetings. You know, it often, especially here in New England, that monthly sort of meeting or bi-weekly meetings that they have where they really are making good decisions about and thinking about development proposals and the impacts it may have. So do you want to put the poll up, Marianne? I have a quick poll just to get a sense of anybody here. Here we go. The one question: have you ever served on a municipal planning board or planning commission? Just yes or no, so we can get a sense of your familiarity. If you want to go ahead and vote, and then what are the results? So 82% people say no, 18 yes. So we've got a couple people that have some experience with that. So thank you. We can close the poll. So if we go to the next slide, it outlines my research, real research question in developing this project. I really was curious to really try to get a better understanding of, if we're saying communities should be doing finding ways to incorporate conservation, land conservation into this planning process, how are they doing this? So that was really my research question. So the next, if you click on the graphic. So this is a graphic that I've sort of been thinking through as a way of outlining what I mean by the land use planning process. In general, communities develop master plans or comprehensive plan. It's called different things in different states, but here in New Hampshire, we call them master plans. So those are put together. They give a sort of a guiding policy of sort of the vision and goals and objectives, and then some specific, it looks at alternatives and comes up with specific steps and scenarios and tries to come up with the best sort of path forward. It's a plan, you know, determine the best way to achieve the goals that were set out in the plan. Really, though, within planning, though, a main way that they get implemented can be through a variety of projects, but the policy aspects in many ways gets implemented through land use regulations, including our zoning ordinances, but also subdivision and site plan review regulations or development review. So usually that involves applications coming to a planning board for decision about some new subdivision or new construction of a building or redevelopment of a site, perhaps. There's a lot of components within that, and zoning really looks at different types of land uses and separating different incompatible land uses historically. So then how that implementation piece really gets enforced through different types of policies, through the board's review in their application process. But then eventually, if something's going to get built and constructed, they have to still follow back to what the plans say. And then, you know, ultimately development happens. So we end up with subdivisions, parcelization of lands, construction of different sites. So where do we incorporate conservation in this process throughout? Next slide, please. So this is the two regions that we've been working in, and I should have said in the beginning too that Matea Powers is an undergraduate student. I don't know if she's on here today, but she made these maps, so thank you very much, Matea. She engaged in this project as a research assistant, helping me with all the data collection and some of the map making. But we ended up focusing on two areas of New Hampshire, the Ashwellet River region in sort of the southwest corner of New Hampshire, and then another area in southeast New Hampshire, or around the seacoast. Each region has 10 towns in it, and this map also shows different percentages of conserved land in these communities. So you can see that a couple of communities have some larger kind of more connected areas of conservation, and other communities have it more scattered around and different amounts in different communities. Next slide, please. So just to give you a quick overview of what we were looking at for data, what we involved was we collected master plans, we collected the subdivision, site plan review, and zoning ordinances, and planning board minutes, because we wanted to have documentation about what these boards and groups were actually doing in their meeting time. So because of the way some communities structure their master plans with individual chapters, not as one documents, but anyways, this is a quick overview that we ended up collecting 573 documents from the total of the 20 communities. So it was a lot of information to look over, especially when it came to the planning board minutes, because we looked for over 2 years of minutes. But all of this was collected just from websites, from towns and things. So again, Matea helped a lot with the data collection and storage of all this information. Next slide, please. So what we did was we used a software program called Invivo, which allows you to bring in digital documents. And we just started searching, especially for the master plans. This was really our approach to find areas within these large documents, just kind of things that we thought were key terms that related to conservation. So you can see what some of those words were here. Both the area that the geographical areas we were looking at and these terms, we actually had met with the Nature Conservancy's New Hampshire chapter and kind of thinking through, and it kind of has a little bit of an overview, and they are interested in trying to understand this local approach better too. So they helped us with kind of thinking through some of these tools, as well as some planning professionals also looked at this too. Next slide. So what we did when this software program Invivo allows you to just quickly do a search, and you can search through like all the master plans we collected for each region, and you can come up with just numbers and counts. So this tells us the number of sources that maybe mentioned the word habitat. So we had seven master plan documents that said that, and out of those 7 documents, it was mentioned 68 times. So we did these sort of counts as to try to get a sense of how much occurrences of these words were, but it doesn't really tell us much, because it doesn't, you know, it shows you the conservation, open space, protect, wildlife are kind of our big word, are more frequently used. But some of the other ones that you might expect, like land conservation, is not used that often in comparison to wildlife, say. Next slide. So what we did then was we had to kind of classify each of these terms, and we also basically also had to kind of sort out what they meant. Sometimes open space and green space really means landscaping, and conserve, protect can refer to other types of even like energy conservation. So we started to have to weed through as we went through reading these documents. Next, please. So really the key part of the data analysis comes from what we call coding and themes. So once we kind of separated out things that weren't as relevant, we then said, okay, if you're using the word, say, conservation, what's the context? If some community is suggesting purchasing more land for conservation, we labeled that as kind of an action item related to land conservation. Other times there may have been something that was more like a residential conservation subdivision, so we label that as such. So it allows us to kind of label the terms and how they're used, and then we actually group those codes into larger themes, which is on the next slide, please. I think we've got, oh, actually this is the next slide, is just giving you a sense of the codes for the different types of data that we had, because it was a little bit different. So here is this categorizing these codes into themes. So again, depending on the type of documents we were looking at, they were a little bit different. Especially when we came to land use regulations, it really came down more to assessing whether there was a presence or absence of certain types of regulatory functions that you might expect to see in those types of things. And then the planning board minutes, we were really looking to see how they are discussing conservation related components in those documents, which is evidence of what their meeting time is spent doing what kind of work. So next slide. I'm going to go through these next slides pretty quickly, so bear with me. Most of the text on these is here just to give sort of evidence of what we found around these themes. In general, mostly a lot of the content that we found related to land conservation was really broad statements like preserve open space and plan to acquire land for future recreational purposes. Doesn't give you a lot of direction in these. Again, they're very open, broad general statements about sort of desires that the communities that we each had. Then I should also mention that the designation of A9 or A2 is Ashwellet, and then the number refers to a town. We're using codes because we're not trying to compete one town against another or make comparisons between towns. We're really just looking at this as a region of what is this group of communities saying and how are they saying it as a set of data. So the next one, please. So another kind of theme that we found beyond broad statements was trying to say that was a very common, more specific kind of action item really that came out in their master plans was saying, hey, we need to find some ways to identify resources, identify certain types of lands, the typical kind of natural resource inventory that a communities may use. This seemed to be something that in the master plans, at least, communities could kind of grasp onto and say, hey, if we get more information and a better inventory of our resources, then maybe we can do something with it. So that was a piece that kind of came together as a theme from many of the statements we found. Next slide, please. So well, I can jump ahead here. So yeah, collaboration was another one. There's a number of communities that felt kind of hinted towards a more regional approach perhaps, and that they were recognizing that they needed to work with partners, which was encouraging to think that whether it was government agencies, state, federal, or nonprofits, land trusts, that kind of thing. But there was, you know, kind of the sense that it would be good to reach out and get some collaboration with other organizations too. Next slide. So the next part was really thinking about in their master plans, how are they thinking ahead for implementation of land conservation goals through land use regulations, zoning, subdivision, development review, site plan review types of regulations. So in a number of cases, the communities would say, hey, we should consider adopting some kind of techniques in our regulations. If possible, we could do this. And we want to try to encourage developers to use these types of techniques. You know, in a statement like use zoning to preserve open space. Again, that's another kind of broad statement, but it's trying to tie how a regulatory approach could perhaps preserve open space, and thinking about designating sort of overlay districts to conserve some specific types of resources. Next, please. Oh yeah, and then sorry, if we go back there, while they had these statements, only one municipality actually specifically noted that while they have had regulations in place, it had never been used. So it kind of brought up this question of like, well, what good is the regulation if it isn't really particularly used? Next, please. And lastly, under the master plans, there was discussion about, hey, we need to acquire some lands. It would be good to purchase conservation lands or easements. That was recognized as an approach that was also beneficial for land conservation. And then tied to conservation was ideas about funding, of some thoughts of perhaps mechanisms of generating some revenue within the community, which I won't go into the details on that too much. So next, please. So when we get into looking more at the regulations, what we were trying to see was there sort of this presence or absence of some type of conservation subdivision, clustering, requirements for open space and development review, what types of things were they really looking at in that? So it was the kind of concept of concentrating development somewhere to leave some more green open space and potential habitat for protecting resources in a variety of ways. Next slide, please. So within this region, really what we found out of the 10 communities, there was actually only one that really specifically had some type of conservation-minded subdivision that allowed this sort of clustering. It really just it was kind of surprising that there was this need, and often mentioned that this is a good way to approach this, but they didn't really have those tools in place. So the next slide, please. So for zoning aspects, we ended up kind of, again, looking for different types of conservation-related regulations that are more specific to zoning. We found that 8 out of 10 municipalities usually had something. They were more sometimes geared towards buffers, steep slopes. Protecting land, but also really to protect aquifers is often another driving factor. But one thing that became pretty apparent was that anytime you have these protections, they're usually kind of driven by a development proposal, because they kick in when there's some kind of activity and development there. So what they really mean too by open space isn't always clear in terms of the long-term sort of management of those spaces. Next slide, please. So lastly, we end getting to how they address these types of things in the minutes. We didn't get data from 2 of the towns. We only had 8 towns instead of the 10. But again, it was a fair number of documents we were working with. In the coding process, what we found was there was really minimal work on any kind of meaningful strategic land conservation. If you go to the next slide. This next slide really talks about what that small amount of times that they used, the term sort of conservation related in their planning board minutes came. If you actually go back one, please, there was right here. Yeah, there was thought that, they mentioned revising the master plan or possibly working on some regulations or thinking through how applications came. They did have some kind of, application that would trigger something, but it wasn't really clear. Anyways, next slide. So going back to this framework that I had of sort of my research question here of, where does conservation fit in this process? The conservation sort of science community is suggesting that land use planning can be a good way to promote land conservation, but where does it fit? So next slide. And I would say overall, and I forgot to say in the beginning, we've got these 2 regions. My analysis isn't done yet on the Seacoast region, so I'm just presenting this one Asheville area. But really what we're finding is that, clearly through this process, conserved land, open space is a result of development. It's created because of some developments happening around it. Most often it seems that recreational purposes is kind of the driving factor for wanting that conserved areas or open space. Public use is not always clear if it's fully accessible to everybody. And long-term management and monitoring of these sort of what we're labeling as conserved spaces through this development process or planning process isn't really well addressed. Next slide. So I would say where we are so far in the summary is that while we found evidence that communities state that land conservation is a goal, but they haven't necessarily adopted the best sort of regulatory process in the realm that they have to work with to be particularly innovative or strategic in their work. And I think that's what's really most important, is that that land use process seems to be helping to reduce the impacts of development and protect our resources, but not really good for strategic promoting and conserving land and natural resources. Next slide. So while I would suggest that, our next steps, we have to finish the analysis of the other region, but I'm really going to be working on sharing this with planner networks that I have, planner conferences, but also conservation groups to try to find ways to kind of bring those 2 pieces together. I've tried to sort of use practical knowledge that from the planning side into thinking on that, how could conservation groups benefit from thinking through where they can best fit where these local land use decisions are really being made. And then also finding ways for planners and municipalities to think about having some more specific strength in their arguments in their documents and things, and to try to create more strategic ways for developing conservation. So I think that's my last slide, except for my thank you slide. So next slide. So again, just thank you to Matea and to those that helped in a research grant that I had to help with this process too.
June, that was great. That was really interesting. I'm going to open it up just to a couple of questions now, because I think that the topics of your research are a little bit different, and people may forget the question that they have for you later. I don't see. Let's see. I see no questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to ask one myself, which is, if you wanted to be proactive about conservation in New Hampshire, and there are many people who do, you pointed out that the local planning boards may not be the first place you would go to develop that thing, because well, actually, let me ask it differently. Where would you first go? Would you go to a planning board, or would you go to your local land trust, or would you go to an regional conservation group, or what would you do?
I think, something I've been actually thinking about a lot, and I think ideally we should be moving to find ways to work with all together. And that piece of the collaboration and kind of pointing, my research is sort of looking to see where there's these disconnects in a way in that planning process. So if once we now see that, then we can sort of say, okay, well, the community may have some broad goals stated in their master plan, but how are they really implementing? How are they getting to that point? And is it strategic? Is it really satisfying that desire to have larger landscapes, connected areas, specific types of habitat? What are the larger conservation communities' goals, and how to bring that together into this process that is so sort of piecemeal and step and parcel by parcel by design. Maybe there's some ways we can kind of alter that process a little bit. It might take a few years, especially in New Hampshire. But.
Great. Well, so I have a comment here from David Foster, and then David, I'm going to ask you to elaborate just a little bit on that if we can unmute you. But let me read what you've written first. David Foster, director of the Harvard Forest, former director of the Harvard Forest, and still on the Harvard faculty. This was a fascinating presentation that provides a compelling argument for what seems like an obvious suggestion that we don't often heed. Conservation and planning should partner more. Regional conservation partnerships have emerged as an effective way to bring many conservation entities together. Would that scale be an effective way to bring planning into conservation? And would this involve local planning boards, regional planners, or both? So that's the question, and then we'll let David elaborate a little bit.
Well,
Go ahead.
I'm fascinated by the opportunities for planners and conservationists to work together more. And one of the questions is at what scale and how to do that so that it works in a coherent fashion. So I'd just be interested in hearing a few comments about the different scales that planning operates at and how best conservation should be interacting with it, or whether it in fact should be working at the scale of local land trusts as well as regional and statewide entities.
I think, yeah, the question of scale is obviously an important one, because especially the scale of some land trusts or land conservation organizations work at a much more bigger landscape kind of scale, and planning boards work parcel by parcel, responding to these kinds of development applications. I see in the chat there's another comment about that, sort of also the time scale of reacting versus planning to by design. And sometimes planning is more, the work of the boards is more reacting to development, but that doesn't mean they don't have the opportunity to think more broadly. And I think planners and planning boards need to be pushed to do that more. And I think the conservation community could probably help with that, especially on these regional conservation partnerships. But I think it's kind of coming together to talk about these differences of scale and trying to find ways to work to bring those together somehow. I just don't think, I haven't seen evidence really of a lot of that yet. And I'm sure there's case studies out there that I'm not aware of, and I would love to hear those. But it sort of feels like, you know, conservationists or sort of scientists are saying, hey, they recognize that this local autonomy is there for decision making, but they're not fully realizing how their bigger work fits into that, if that makes sense.
So we have about 6 questions that just popped up, but I want to move on to Elizabeth at this point, and then we'll take the rest of the questions to the extent that we can at the end of the session. But June, thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. I think we all got a lot out of it, if only to learn that, well, you know, at the town level, there's maybe more work to be done. So thank you for that. And I want to introduce now Elizabeth Hammond Infield, who is a full professor of regional planning in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning at UMass Amherst. Bill Labick is the way that we got to meet Elizabeth. He was a student of Elizabeth's at UMass Amherst and had an epiphany of sorts when he was on a trip in Chile, thinking, these people in Chile, they really need some regional planning. And then he thought, well, actually, in New England, we really need some regional scale planning as well. And that's how we started out on this project with Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, it's a pleasure to have you here, and let me give the microphone to you.
All right, thank you, Jim. I really appreciate that. And June, I thought that was a great presentation. It raises all sorts of interesting questions I hope we do get to talk about. But what I'll talk about today is this work I've done with the Northern Appalachian Trail Landscape Partnership. And it's a stakeholder engagement project, which is really designed to increase collaboration in conservation along this landscape. And I'll talk about that a little more. Whoa. Can you go back one slide, please? Thank you. And also on the first slide was my email. I'm happy to get questions and comments and things like that. So great, thank you. All right, next one is good. So my talk is organized in there are 4 relative things four relatively short things I'm gonna try and do. The first is to talk about what Natlp is and what the goals were of this process. I'll describe what the process was, and I'll give you some of the results of the themes that have arisen and a little reflection on how we're gonna implement those. And then I think Dennis Schaefer is gonna talk about that a little bit too, because he's involved in this effort. I have not included much on method here, despite being an academic, just because time goes by quickly. So it's more of a participatory action research framework that we're undertaking, but it is based on some of the same principles that June presented about identifying what themes were from qualitative work. And that'll be clear as we go on. So next slide, please. So let me just do a quick poll if we can. Marianne, can you do that? Yeah. How much do you know about RCPs? And if you don't know what that stands for, then it's clearly the bottom one, little to none. So if you folks would just give a quick vote on that, that would be great. I'm sorry, I don't know when to say, yeah, to go into show the results, but as soon as you can. So, okay, all right. So I'll just talk a little bit about that, then you can close that. So everybody here will be familiar with local land trusts, right? So the regional conservation partnership model has developed to provide a regional framework within which we do land conservation. So the local land trust can do peer-to-peer learning, come together and identify shared interests and how they can work together, get funding, those sorts of things. And so those create, the local land trusts work together to create a regional conservation partnership. Highstead Foundation, along with Harvard Forest and other organizations, have really pushed this idea forward, and And then for what I'm talking about today, those regional conservation partnerships are partnering up into this even bigger landscape, which is the northern half of the Appalachian Trail. And Hysted provides some funding for the RCP. They're also helping out the Natlp and are one of the main hosts. And then there's some funding from the Wild East Action Fund as well that has helped us do this particular strategic planning process. So let's go to the next slide if we can. Thanks. The landscape of the Appalachian Trail, as most you know, goes from Georgia to Maine, all the way up to Mount Katahdin. In order to be able to do something more effective, the AT got divided by these partnerships into two sections, the northern and the southern. So we're talking just about the northern, but that still goes from New York City up to the end of Maine. So it's huge. And as you can see from this map, it involves a lot of different RCPs. And within each of those RCPs are different land trusts. So there's a lot of organizations and moving parts in this effort. But the basic idea is the black line there is the Appalachian Trail. And the Appalachian Trail itself, as many of you know, is actually pretty narrow in terms of the conserved land. And so the partners wanted to identify ways to increase the conservation around the trail so that it's a more effective ecological corridor. You know, as we particularly need to have corridors for species to move through climate change. And in addition, to make it relevant and helpful to social conditions, which I think is our next slide, if you would. So before I talk about that, let me just do tribal acknowledgement, because the Natlp's work is on land that is has been historically and often is currently land of the Algonquian peoples and many tribal nations. It's really, when you start to do the research, you can see it's a really big list. So this is certainly some of them, but I wouldn't want to say it's all of them, but just want to acknowledge that the landscape we're working in has deep pre-colonial roots and also has existing multiple nations involved. So thanks. Let's go to the next slide. So some of the social values. So there's the goal of increasing conservation, large landscape conservation projects around the AT in ways that sustain the core conservation values. But those core conservation values include things like public health, ecotourism, hiking, climate change, activism, these sorts of a pretty broad portfolio of the co-benefits of conservation. Next slide, please. Okay, so I tend to be a short talker, so I'm cruising through here. You may have to come back and ask me questions, and that'd be totally fine. So I'll try and slow down a little bit more. So the Natlp strategic planning process is what we've been working on for the last year. And the main goal is what almost all strategic planning processes are, is to identify what should be the priorities for the next 5 years. Natlp just completed their first 5 years, and so we're trying to identify what are the next steps. But as Hysted and Bill Labick and Dennis and Harvard Forest, David Foster, like a lot of people worked on this. As that was getting conceptualized, it was clear that it was important that the movement forward not just be about land conservation, but also be about these sort of social goals and inclusion. And particularly given the environment we're working in this year, that inclusion is become increasingly clear, has got to really address equity, diversity, and justice as we go forward, both in the process that we use and in the practices that partners engage in. So that's a second important part of this process, and it's what I'll be talking about mostly today for the rest of the time. And then the third main goal was to help build social capital through cross-sector and community engagement as partners got to know conservation organizations, got to know economic development organizations, got to know COVID response groups, like just sort of creating more networks. And so the outcomes of the plan should be the plan, expanded partnerships, and ideally a diversity, equity, and inclusion action plan. For this talk today, I'm using the DEI as the acronym. Some people like JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I'm just using DEI for today. So So let's go to the next slide, please. We started this process in February. Things came to a screeching halt in March, as did everything else. And I particularly really like this t-shirt. Very bad, would not recommend. Yes, most of us know. But after everybody got a little bit sorted, we restarted the process in the spring and early summer, and I typed in 4, but it was actually 5 focus groups with using sort of a snowball sampling technique, brought together the existing stakeholders to identify who else we should be talking to, did some research on the web and through the communities to try and broaden those contacts, and had a lot of people suggesting new people, so that we could develop these focus groups of people that were not in Natlp to start with in the 5 groups. And the 5 groups were one group on economic development, which was mostly, not mostly, it was included like local economic development organizations, breweries, some businesses, economic development. Second one was outdoor groups, which is folks who ran voluntary trail organizations, hunters, anglers, all the people that do, use the outdoor recreational space, not all, but a sampling of those. We had one that focused on environmental equity, environmental activism. So it had conservation organizations and youth activism and those sorts of groups. So that was 3. And then the 4th one was on, let me space out, I took notes. Anyway, the 5th one, I'll just leap ahead. The 5th one was on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I'll be talking about that more. And so we'll come to this fall, we've been undertaking strategic planning meetings. 2 already done, a 3rd on the way tomorrow. We'll have a strategic plan by December. And part of that is going to be these new advisory boards that are a result of this process that, again, I'll return to at the end, and Dennis is going to discuss a little bit too. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Focus groups, what we found. I do want to note that my master's student, Steve Carey, was an enormous help throughout this process. So some of what you'll hear is the work of us collaborating together along with these other groups. So next slide, please. Right, I hope you can read this reasonably well. When you work with qualitative data, as many of you will know, you go through a process of organizing and coding and then reorganizing and bringing together, and eventually the goal is that you'll identify some themes that capture some of the most important things that were talked about in the groups. And so as we worked it through for the Natlp mission, the responses from the focus groups fell fairly nicely into 5 basic themes. And starting from here and moving up and over, there was the opportunities for new collaborations that's right, that was the focus group was on federal agencies, federal and state agencies. And there's an opportunity to bring them in ways that we haven't done that much before. Maybe not officially, because if you're a government worker, it's complicated, but nevertheless, there could be more coordination, and that there are new user groups. Coming around to this area, in the diversity, equity, inclusion, there are 2 general categories. The first is how to diversify users and be sure that the trail itself and the practices of the RCPs and the underlying land trusts along it encourage use by everyone, including less typical users. So ways to do that include addressing barriers, inclusive marketing, and public health partners. I'll go into this in more detail on the next slide. And then, so that's the practices, and then there's the process as well, which we could think of as, a sort of distributional practical equity and then process equity, including things like recognizing tribal foundations for where we're acting, collaborating across lines, doing inclusive history, and being sure that there's representation from a lot of different people in our practices. Framing our story was a really interesting process or discussion as well. It's clear, many of you work in small towns, you know that finances are strapped, people's jobs are challenging, and it needs to be clear for many people, it needs to be made very clear that conservation does not necessarily bring economic harm to communities and residents. And so there was a lot of discussion about how we could make that case and frame our stories in ways that will make us part of the community rather than in opposition to it. And this is a long practice that many groups have been working on, but some of the things that were mentioned in this area were small town support, being sure that we've reached out to small towns and that we're engaging them in the process. Talking about the benefits of multiple use, because while Natlp is about conservation, a lot of that conservation is also on working lands, including farms and forests. So this fits in well with the mission. Payment in lieu of taxes. Many organizations make those, even if they're nonprofit, they pay, even if they're not required to pay taxes. It's important to be really public about that, because otherwise the economic cost can appear quite substantial. And then there's a sense that if we could increase the public education on these items that are already happening, that would be really beneficial. Coming over to this side of the themes, because of the timing of it, it was a great opportunity to ask some questions of the conservation community and these users of what the impact of COVID has been on their experience in using conserved land. And so some of the things that they talked about is that COVID has brought, and the lack of tourism has brought very significant stress on local nonprofits and other resources. For instance, local history, those really great small history buildings that many community has, those are going to have difficulty reopening, was the sense. And that would be a reduction in the quality of the experience along the AT and in the communities. There may be, people think there is, I'm sure you've read about this, a sense that many people who had second homes may have moved to their second homes, that there may be increased dispersion into small towns. Certainly Vermont is very concerned about this, those sorts of questions. We'll see whether those are in fact long-term. One of the things that everybody talked about though was impact on trails from overuse. One of the wonderful things about COVID, there aren't many, but one of them is a lot of people got outside who may not in fact be in the habit of being outside, and that's great. But many of them went to the trails that are the most commonly known, right? And so there was a lot of concern that many trails were getting very negatively impacted, and it would be better if we could spread use across different trails. If you're an ecologist, there's an argument about sacrifice zones and concentrating use and then leaving it more. Anyway, it's complicated, but this is what people talked about. And so there was a need to disperse trail use. And also just to recognize the economic harm that COVID has brought to many local guides, hotels, and these sorts of things. So those are the big themes that came out of the focus groups. I could have the next slide, please. And then if we just focus in on diversity, equity, inclusion, there were essentially 4 big categories of themes. One would be priority access for Indigenous people, the idea that there may be different rules and clear procedures for tribal members to come on land and, gather for medicinals or that sort of thing. And also do the tribal recognition for lands, that there's a big opportunity to use land for healing. And when that would be healing for, under discussion, was veterans, trauma survivors, addiction recovery, being Black in America. And that when we think about those healing landscapes, it's important to think about them both for giving space for isolation and decompression when people need to be alone, but also space for socialization and community building, and that both of those can play a role in this healing. And so part of the healing is being sure that there are jobs and knowledge, there are jobs developed and knowledge transmitted across generations. And we think about reducing barriers to use. Some of this came up a little before. Transit access, feeling safe. This was an interesting one. Talked about how if you are female or African American, it might not be that comfortable to wander into a small town in the evening. So we need to think about that. Having publications that have inclusive photos, knowledge of gear, and then truth telling in the landscape was also very interesting. It really talks about how to increase the diversity of history as people go forward and talk about the challenges in the landscape. Last slide, I think. Right, so what we're doing going forward is using these in our strategic planning process, but also thinking about developing 2 advisory boards, one that would focus in on developing long-term relationships with tribes in the area. That needs to be a very steady, important long-term managed process. And then another one would be more sort of trying to be sure that we get relatively fast answers about how to improve our practices through having a task force on diversity practices. And that I'm gonna stop, thank you.
Elizabeth, that was great. For somebody who volunteered in the summer on a Micmac reserve in New Brunswick, Canada, I was fascinated with the focus you put on tribes and can see how that over time could make a huge difference. I want to ask Dennis Schaefer. Dennis, you should unmute yourself to comment on this. Dennis is the Large Landscape Coordinator, if I remember the title correctly, for the Appalachian Trail Conference, which is a nonprofit that works with the National Park Service to Appalachian Trail Conservancy, not the conference, pardon me, to maintain the trail and to enhance it and to enhance its relationships with communities. So Dennis, do you want to comment just very briefly about the impact that Elizabeth's work is having on the way that your community is thinking about going forward?
Sure, thanks, Jim. I'll just make a couple brief, share a couple brief thoughts. First of all, let me just say that our work with Elizabeth and UMass is a great example of collaboration between an academic institution and our land conservation partners, which is what ALPINE's all about, right? It's a great collaborative effort. And as Elizabeth described, we've engaged with her to help facilitate this strategic planning exercise for the Northern ATLP. And early on, she helped us to flag that there were voices missing and representatives missing from the table. And what really has been an important part of that exercise or this work is to help us find ways to bring those voices and those representatives into our strategic planning process and most importantly into our future work. Broadening our outreach and engagements been a major focus not only for the Northern ATLP but for the Appalachian Trail Landscape Partnership trail-wide from Georgia to Maine. It's a major topic. It's a major challenge. We all recognize that. And I think the innovation and some of the things that you saw in those last couple slides from Elizabeth demonstrate sort of the new ways of thinking that she's been able to bring to this partnership. The Northern ATLP is frequently a model for other collaborative efforts along the trail, what we call nested initiatives, other regional conservation partnership type initiatives up and down the trail. And I think this JEDI, DEI work, however you want to call it, that Elizabeth is leading us down is another great example where the Northern ATLP is going to be a model that we're going to take to other areas along the trail. And the conversations are already happening, and where there's been a lot of attention paid to this effort, and everybody's very anxious and looking forward to it continuing forward and seeing what results of not just talking about bringing new partners to the table, but actually bringing new partners to the table and engaging them in our work. So thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks, Jim, for having us.
Thank you, Dennis. I want to add, Elizabeth, that this came up in the context of the large landscape peer learning initiative that the Lincoln Institute sponsored between some regional land trusts in Chile and in the United States. We're just now organizing a second cohort that's going to include the United States, Canada, China, Australia, and Romania. And especially in the United States, Canada, and Australia, there's going to be a major focus on interaction with Indigenous communities. So what you're doing here is going to help to inform the conversation between the first cohort, represented by Dennis and Bill, among others, and this second cohort of people who are working in places like the Yukon and in the outback in Australia. So the ripple effect just keeps going. Now, I have another question early on for you. It's from Jane Wynn. Hello, Jane. I haven't talked to you in a long time, who I believe is now in Western Massachusetts. And she asks, how can we partner to design and fund an AT and wildlife overpass over the Mass Pike, Route 90 in Massachusetts, that would be a better experience for hikers than the current pair of bridges, and work for wildlife crossing the Pike as well? So this is not a JEDI question, but I'm sure that you heard comments about this as well as you were doing your focus groups. Do you want to comment on that at all?
I can say really quickly, yes, incredibly important. And it's an amazing new area for work, is to figure out how to do highway crossings for wildlife. You know, and that's really the topic. It's a whole different design process. And I think it's really going to be exciting and provides a lot of opportunities. So I'm not sure how we can, UMass has done some of that. So if we can help, let me know. In my department, the landscape architects.
All right, well, Jane is still working with the Berkshire Environmental Action Team. She writes, so I'm sure she will seek you out and see if there are ways that she can help do that. So I'm going to ask a question from Megan McLean, who asked the question earlier, but I think it applies both to you and June, if June is still on. June, are you still there? Okay, so here's the question. Some towns also have conservation boards and commissions. How do you see them playing a role in the conservation process? I think this is in Massachusetts as well. In the conservation process and working with influencing land trusts and planning boards. So I will broaden this to say, how in addition do you bring these public commissions into this broader conversation, Elizabeth, that you've started with communities around the Appalachian Trail? How do you engage them in a meaningful way so that we're all, so to speak, rowing in the same direction? And June, you, given your expertise with public commissions, must have a thought on the same. So who wants to go first? Elizabeth, you started. Okay, go ahead.
I could do a little connecting thing, because I was thinking about scale when it comes to this. I think the local land trusts working with the town in which they're located can be really good, and probably one or the other will have the big picture vision. Because one of the challenges with the town conserving land, for instance, through community conservation subdivision design, is you want to be sure that the land that's conserved is connected and meaningful, ecological, functioning land. So that has to be done with a big picture view, right? that connects the conservation, the planning, and the land trust.
Right.
That's one answer.
That is my experience as well. And that if the land trusts get involved, sometimes they can bridge over to the next town and the next town and say, okay, how can all three of us, even though we don't have the same town government, how can we link efforts to try to get something done over a larger scale? June, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, you know, I've heard this type of question before in different types of similar types of projects, looking at different topics within this kind of planning process. At least in New Hampshire, the conservation commissions don't really have any true decision-making authority. They do reviews of some types of wetland permits and things. So they're more of an advisory role, and they play a little bit different kind of position in different communities, just depending on the community. That said, I think that they do offer a lot, and they can have some very knowledgeable members that think about key resources in the community. I also think they could have a good role in thinking sort of longer term of management of areas that might become conserved as a result of this land use process. That's something that I don't think communities are really, you know, thinking enough about, and how to engage. Say you have a conservation subdivision, there's a piece that's conserved. How is it conserved, and whose responsibility in perpetuity to maintain it? Is it a homeowners association? Is it the town? And does that mean the town conservation commission, or is it engaging a land trust? So there's lots of areas, I think, to start thinking more broadly and regionally to collaborate with different boards, the land trust community, that sort of thing. I haven't dug into that probably enough, but I think it bears some looking into, but it also has to do with sort of the structure of what each board is sort of statutorily allowed to do. So
I think you're right. I want to throw out one last comment from a participant, Robert Sanford, who says that planning boards in Maine seem mostly reactive rather than truly planning. How do you think we can overcome that? And I think we've just been circling around that same question, which is, how do we engage public officials to understand that there may be a vision for the region that's larger than just the next subdevelopment on the next road and the next in the next water distribution system. So do either one of you want to comment on that as we go out, and then I will close out?
I can take a stab at it, because I have, you know, again, that's a question that I have heard a lot and thought a lot about. It's hard. Our structure, I think, is sort of set up for our planning boards, commissions, not just in Maine or New Hampshire, but really across the country, to be somewhat reactionary. They have some responsibilities to react to development proposals. That said, they also have responsibilities to do broader comprehensive plans, master plans, and they sort of miss that connection between every application for development needs to, you know, they have an opportunity, but they miss it to think like, how does this fit in that bigger picture? And then how does it fit in that regional picture? And what goals are we trying to achieve by saying yes or no to these proposals for development? I think it's a lot about training of boards and planners to make sure we, you know, don't lose the forest for the trees, perhaps.
That's a good metaphor to use right now, forest and trees. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Oh, I was just gonna, this might not work in the politics of Maine, but in Massachusetts, the governor has implemented this municipal vulnerability preparedness program, where towns really were bribed into doing plans, and that can be tied in with land conservation, and then the state is giving them funding to do actions for resilience. A lot of that is infrastructure, but it wouldn't have to be. So that might be one sort of top-down way to encourage a little more forward thought.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I want to thank June Hammond Rowan and Elizabeth Hammond Infield for what really turned out to be a very interesting discussion of two separate pieces of research that overlap quite a bit and that begin to point the way towards the necessity of having the civic sector and the public sector interact more and more over time. So with that, I wish you all a nice afternoon, and we will be back with future sessions of the ALPINE webinar series. The next one coming up thank you, Robin, for throwing that up there just at the right time, is on Wednesday, December 3rd at 12:30, How Land Conservation Affects Both Environmental and Economic Outcomes. It's a very interesting piece of research by Kate Sims, Associate Professor of Economics at Amherst College, with several colleagues. And just as a teaser for the future, shows an outcome that actually towns that conserve land actually have improved, in many cases, improved fiscal health and even better employment. So with that, I bid you all a great afternoon, and thank you so much for coming. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.